but these voices have always been there. This is the root of the importance of inclusive civic engagement. Civic engagement means that the whole community works together to create action around community needs. And this work is even more important during the time of a pandemic, when we are fragmented and the most vulnerable people in our communities are maybe not having their voices heard. As organizations, we're making decisions about changing the way that we operate and respond to COVID. But are we hearing all of the voices and the voices from people who are the most affected? The goal of civic engagement is to address public concerns and promote the quality of the community. And I'm so excited that we're having these conversations, because as organizations, we have to be able to do our best to make sure that all community members are heard and served, even in the hard times that we're having of a pandemic. So let's see. Scott, could you go back one for me? I'm not sure how to make that happen. Thank you. So how can we as organizations support inclusive civic engagement and inclusive community engagement? Well, it's about external and internal work. Inwardly, we have to equip ourselves with awareness and training to better serve the communities that we're trying to engage with. We need to hold our organizations and leadership accountable toward meeting inclusion goals. And we need to allow our community members to hold us accountable for dismantling inequities in policies and practices and in laws. So that's the inward work, but let's talk about the outward work. Outwardly, we need to make sure that we're showing up for people's stuff. We have to value, support, and celebrate community voices. We have to build relationships and community partnerships and have visibility out there. We have to create an understanding around community needs and issues that people in the community care about: safety, education, housing, health. And we have to listen to all of those community members. See, one click forward. So inclusive public engagement is not only the right thing to do, it's what builds strong, sustainable relationships and helps to capture a complete range of values and perspectives. Getting diverse public feedback leads to better decision-making and policy decisions, and gaining a full range of perspectives also increases the likelihood of successful implementation of programming, because we're having the entire community take ownership and all of their voices have been heard. All of us own a piece to this puzzle of making our community work. And I'm excited that we're having this conversation so we can get better at it. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Scott.
Great, thank you, Parker, for that introduction. And I'm going to put up another poll real quick as we introduce the next speaker. So coming up next will be Bora Simmons from the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education. And Bora was the lead for putting together guidelines for excellence in community engagement as part of that project. So we're welcoming Bora in all the way from Eugene, Oregon. And I'll go ahead and close our poll out in about 5 seconds here. The question again is, how important is community discourse and participatory decision processes in determining the future of how water is managed? And from least to most, it looks like most folks are saying nearly the most, and some saying the most, with none, with only one saying the least. So thank you for your feedback on that. And I'm going to go ahead and turn the microphone over to Bora. And Bora, you should now have control of the mouse.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Good morning to everybody. I'm really excited that I could join you today. It's such an important topic. What I'm going to do is take a couple of minutes, as Scott suggested, to introduce you to the community engagement guidelines for excellence and highlight how they can be used as a tool for fostering civic engagement strategies. Oops, it didn't move forward. There we go. So first, I just want to give you a little bit of background about the National Project for Excellence series. The project, it's really, maybe it has to hit twice. Scott, it stopped moving. Oh, now we went back to the beginning. Yep, there we go. It's an initiative of NAEE, which is the North American Association for Environmental Education. We're really pleased. I don't know what's going on. There we go. Sorry about this, folks. We're really pleased that we've been funded for this project since its inception by the US EPA Office of Environmental Education. Yeah, there we go. Including the community engagement guidelines, we have 5 other sets of guidelines that may be of interest to you as water educators. A set of guidelines that has to do with instructional materials, the K-12 that has to do with environmental literacy for school-age children, professional development, all about the competencies of an environmental educator, the non-formal program development cycle, and early childhood environmental education. All of these guidelines, frankly, practice what we preach. So they were all developed through a critique and consensus process that involved literally hundreds of individuals and organizations. So now let's jump into the guidelines themselves. They are all about community. They're all about fostering collaborations and taking our work more fully into and with communities. The guidelines focus on how environmental educators can work successfully with communities to protect the environment, promote community well-being, and build sustainability and resilience. The guidelines provide suggestions and a number of tools for supporting inclusive working environments, social equity, effective partnerships, collaboration building, community capacity, and resilience. There are various definitions of community. And what I want to tell you is that we did have sort of, it didn't move forward. There we go. It's the lag time between Oregon and Colorado. That when we were building these community engagement guidelines, that we were looking primarily at and focusing on neighborhoods, towns, cities, and other geographically based communities. But these guidelines may also be useful for working with communities of interest, identity, culture, or belief that may not be bounded by geography. This is why they're particularly important now when we're thinking about virtual communities. The heart of the community engagement guidelines is a set of 5 key characteristics, or really, really big ideas that help us organize our work. The guidelines are based on the idea that environmental education and water education that successfully engages with a community, and especially other community-based organizations, has these 5 characteristics in common. It's community-centered, based on sound education. It's collaborative and inclusive, oriented towards capacity building and civic action, and involves a long-term investment in change. it's really important to note that even though these 5 characteristics are numbered, this is not a linear process. So let's get started with the, sort of the first key characteristic here, that it's community centered. We need to anchor our aims within the context of community interests, issues, and capacities. We need to put the community at the heart of our efforts. But to do this, we need to gather information. Being community-centered involves digging deeply into the community and its dynamics. It involves understanding that the overlapping domains shown in this graphic of social equity, economic prosperity, environmental sustainability, and cultural vitality all contribute to community well-being, sustainability, and resilience. Unfortunately, they are routinely treated separately, as if they were unrelated. But by taking a systems approach to getting to know the community, you'll begin to see the community through a more holistic lens and begin to understand how these interdependent systems are related to one another. With the systems idea in mind, you'll want to gather information that helps answer a number of critical questions. What do you already know about the community? What community assets exist? What do you need to know that you don't know? And the classic, what do you not know that you need to know? You'll also want to reach beyond the usual partners by digging into questions like, which groups, individuals, and efforts already address environmental issues, sustainability, and community well-being? What are they doing, and how does it relate to what you're interested in? What are other possible related areas of community concern? Are there groups interested in literacy, physical fitness, economic development, youth development, or mental health concerns? Who are potential allies? People or groups that can help build bridges among groups. Basically, reach beyond the usual partners. Who is involved? Who should be involved, even if you aren't connected with them yet? At some point, you're going to need to address the elephant in the room. Is community engagement appropriate? Because you have a hammer, not everything is a nail. Is the issue or concern ripe for engagement? Are you ready for community engagement? Personally, professionally? Do you have the skills, temperament, capacities? Are you willing to expose yourself to the vulnerabilities of civic engagement and community engagement work? Is your organization or agency ready? Does it have the capacity? Is the community ready for change? So that's a huge list of questions. In the guidelines, we've crafted over 20 cheat sheets that provide some more details on topics that will help you think about and do this kind of work, help you answer some of those questions, or at least guide you in ways that you can answer these questions. We have cheat sheets on conducting community assessments, thinking about your organizational and professional readiness for community engagement, conducting community asset mapping, and many, many more. All of that was key characteristic 1 out of 5 key characteristics. There's a message here. Community engagement is complex. So moving on, obviously, we want our efforts to be based on sound EE principles, especially within the context of community-based environmental education. We're talking about co-creating and co-designing programs with your partners and collaborators. Key characteristic 3 says that this successful community engagement is collaborative and inclusive. Here we're talking about the need to build coalitions and partnerships strategically, value and incorporate equity and inclusion, work collaboratively, and learn from and resolve conflict. Depending on your background and your partners, as Parker suggested at the beginning, you may want to consider building in training for yourselves to increase cultural competence and the ability to work across differences with partners and community members. There are strategies that can be used throughout your collaboration building efforts. Consider using participatory design or co-creation, collaborative leadership strategies, and collaborative and participatory decision-making as ways of being more inclusive of differing perspectives. And again, there are cheat sheets available to help you get started. The fourth key characteristic says that successful engagement is oriented towards capacity building and civic action. It goes beyond a short-term end. Education efforts support capacity building for ongoing civic engagement and community life, contributing to long-term community well-being, sustainability, and resilience. And finally, successful community engagement depends on a long-term investment in change. Working in communities to create change is typically a long-term initiative, requiring a commitment to relationship building and an ongoing and evolving process of engagement. You can't get it done in a day or a week or a month, probably not even a year or a decade. Now I want to shift a little bit towards community engagement and work that will probably dovetail with the development of a civic engagement and a public participation strategy. The next slide. There we go. We're using civic engagement much like was introduced at the beginning by Parker, that it's any individual or group activity addressing issues of public concern. And when we talk about community engagement, we are in fact trying to engage the whole community, whatever that community is that we define. These activities can be political or non-political in nature, but put simply, civic engagement is the different ways that community members are involved in the process of moving towards solutions. Even if your civic engagement activities are not taking place within that larger community engagement effort, many of the ideas and questions that I just laid out still apply. So developing a civic engagement strategy requires multiple steps or considerations, like just about everything that we do. Early on, you'll need to dissect the issue. You'll need to do some homework. You'll need to understand something about the complexity of the issue, political sensitivity of the issue, potential community impacts, audience or audiences. The answers to these questions will help you determine your overall civic engagement goals. Which brings me to an essential question. What do you want to accomplish? How you involve people will depend on your civic engagement goals, which are often thought about falling on something of a continuum. Do you and your partners want to simply inform participants? Do you want to involve community members in helping you to understand the issue or their concerns? Do you want to collaborate with community members? Or you may see civic engagement as a way to empower community members to make their own decisions about the way forward. Differing communication and involvement strategies are going to be used with each of these different types of goals. You'll inform participants using things like brochures and exhibits and panel discussions, typically pretty one way. You'll involve community members in helping you understand the issue or their concerns by using surveys and focus groups or polls. You'll collaborate with community members through advisory committees, use of participatory decision-making strategies, or consensus workshops. And you'll empower community members to make their own decisions about the way forward through deliberative dialogue and things like study circles or appreciative inquiry strategies. It's important to remember that civic engagement is rarely static, and different strategies may be used at different stages in your process. As you think about your strategy and how you're going to develop it, you need to have a lot of considerations. What resources or expertise are needed? Do you have it within your group of partners, or do you need to go outside of your partners? Can it be implemented in the time available? Who might feel comfortable or uncomfortable, or included or excluded by the particular method you're using? To whom does this tool or technique afford power and decision-making authority? So where are you on that continuum? And what obstacles need to be addressed to effectively use whatever the technique is? Finally, in this time of virtual everything, there are civic engagement tools and tricks that utilize technology. In the guidelines, we provide a short overview and links to some resources that help you think about this. And one of the resources that we link to focuses specifically on using online civic engagement tools. So there are materials and there's help out there for you. And finally, just to tell you that you can download the community engagement guidelines and all of the other sets of guidelines that we've developed for free by just visiting nwe.org/guidelines. And do remember, community engagement and civic engagement strategies are dynamic journeys. There are no simple answers or silver bullets. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Scott.
Thank you so much, Bora. And I wanted to take a minute to put another poll up. And as you're answering this poll, we'll jump into the case studies section of our conversation today. So Bora talked a little bit about best practices for community engagement, and you'll hear from 3 different speakers now on how they're adapting their engagement efforts to the current context. So the poll in front of you is, to what extent has your approach to civic engagement changed in your role since June 2019? I'll give us 5 more seconds to complete the poll. All right, closing the poll now. And we're all learning on this, so I'm going to try to now share the poll results. You didn't see it before, but hopefully you'll see them now. So it seems that most individuals reported that they have not decreased an emphasis on an emphasis on engagement, civic engagement, even in this era of social distancing. So thank you everybody for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kat Weissmiller to talk about work going on at the Colorado Water Conservation Board and the update to the Colorado Water Plan. Take it away, Kat, and then I'll give you controls of the presentation.
Thanks, Scott. I'm still seeing the poll, so.
Is that better?
Yep.
All right.
Let's just go back one slide. There we go. Okay, thank you so much. Your presentation was great. I loved what you were sharing there. Just want to introduce myself. I'm Kat Weissmiller, the Deputy Section Chief for Water Supply Planning for the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And today I'm going to be talking with you about reaching the water community during COVID-19, during the pandemic. And thank you, Scott and WEco, for hosting this. It's a great opportunity. Before I jump into some of our case studies, I want to tell you a little bit about the Colorado Water Conservation Board, or as we call ourselves, the CWCB. We are what we consider ourselves one of Colorado's major water policy agencies. There are a number of other water policy groups, but we work on water supply planning, and we work on policy around that. We also provide technical and financial assistance that supports the Colorado Water Plan, which some of you have probably heard about. And we do work to protect Colorado's streams and lakes. We do flood mitigation, watershed protection, stream restoration, drought planning, and water project financing through our grants program. A little bit more detail about what we do is we facilitate local water planning for 9 basin roundtables across the state, and that's across 8 major river watershed basins. We provide technical updates to statewide data and modeling that supports the Colorado Water Plan. We also partner with other state agencies to use water wisely and protect our water for future generations. And then what's probably most near and dear to our hearts is the Colorado Water Plan. And actually, we just kicked off an update to that this year. To give you an understanding of what our work looks like, the original Colorado Water Plan was released in 2015. It went through 3 different drafts. It took 30 months to develop, and it included 30,000 comments, all of which were responded to. To do that, there were numerous in-person meetings, and this doesn't even consider the previous process, which was the basin implementation plan reports from the local basins that rolled up into the Colorado Water Plan. So it's a very FaceTime heavy, high touch kind of work. We work with stakeholders all the time. It's very busy. So I wanted to give you that perspective as we talk about how we've transitioned into our COVID work. So at the beginning of the year, we were kicking off the water plan update. We've, in the time between January and March, had 9 basin roundtable meetings, a kickoff meeting with consultants and our CWCB team. We had a board meeting, a CWCB presentation, and then a 2-day workshop. And along the way, thousands of other interactions with NGOs and other stakeholders and roundtables and consultants. So again, super high touch, high FaceTime work. Since we've all gone into quarantine in March, our work is starting to look extremely different, and it's a real transition for the stakeholders that typically are involved with some of our water planning. So we have 9 roundtables, and 9 of those roundtables now have GoToMeeting accounts with toll-free numbers. They're using webinars regularly. At least 7 of our roundtables use them on a very regular basis. We've had 5 different roundtables participate in training to move to virtual meetings, and some of those roundtables have actually done trainings on multiple occasions just to make sure that they understand how to do it, how to manage everything, and it's a lot to take in. We've also hosted 4 listening sessions, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. We had 1 board meeting that was virtual, the first ever for CWCB, and we're about to host another. And we had a 6-day virtual workshop to kick off with our contractors leading those local basin planning efforts. And we're learning a lot. So I'm going to talk about 2 specific examples of things that we had to transition quickly and that we did to keep up with what we need to be doing while moving into a virtual format. So the first example is that this 6-day online workshop that I just referenced. It was originally planned as a 3-day in-person workshop for 22 consultants and 18 roundtable members and 5 staff. And as that was planned for the end of April, and as it became increasingly clear that that wasn't going to happen, we had to quickly pivot to a 6-day online workshop with half days, and we trimmed the number of staff and attendees quite a bit to try to bump up engagement. The 6-day workshop is obviously a long time to be sitting in front of your computer, so that's why we shortened the days. And we also, the image that you see on the right is we also moved a lot of the content into a format where people could access it at their own pace, on their own time, maybe ahead of the meeting, so that they could ask questions instead of talking to them about it. And it worked really well from a budgetary perspective, and it kept things on track and advanced the water plan update. But I have to say that there's a serious trade-off there, in the sense that keeping people engaged through 6 days of 5-hour webinars is a real challenge, and particularly when the content is incredibly technical. So that was our first example of how we're doing this, and it was a bit of a challenge, but the next one actually was pretty fun and super successful, I think. And that was the kickoff to our public engagement and public outreach for the Colorado Water Plan update. So in the first 2 weeks of June, we hosted 4 listening sessions around municipal and industrial, forest health and watershed health, agriculture and environment and recreation. Those were basically set up and executed in 3 weeks. It was an incredible turnaround for the idea of moving into reality. And I should note actually that the idea came out of that previous workshop. When things are online, there's so much interest in participation, and a lot of people wanted to participate in those consultant workshops, but we wanted to keep the conversations candid and keep the group small. So we opened up the idea of these listening sessions for larger stakeholder groups and the public, and rolled some of that information into the stakeholder outreach for the Colorado Water Plan update. And so that's how these originated. And we had over 1,200 registrations, over 120 public comments that came out of these sessions. We also exceeded our platform capacity on GoToMeeting and had to shift to streaming it live on YouTube, and we've had over 1,100 views there. And we were able to coordinate 18 speakers. So as you can imagine, that's a lot to do in 3 weeks. But we were really capitalizing on the online format here to bring people to the table in a way that we would never be able to do with venues, registrations, and everything in an in-person format. So those are 2 examples of how we're adapting and trying to bring people to the table for a really outreach and engagement heavy process. We're quickly pivoting to virtual formats, and that involves bravery, among other things, and capitalizing on opportunities to bring stakeholders to the table in new ways. But along the way, obviously, we're learning. We've had some successes and missteps. So I'm going to tell you a couple lessons there. The first, and I can't resist this image, and some of you may know what I'm referring to, but a couple years ago, there was a guy being interviewed live on BBC, and his kids busted in the door and were in his interview, and his wife was frantically trying to get them back in. And I feel like we can all kind of relate to this as we're working from home. So the first lesson is give some grace. Consider what really matters, and the fact that not all engagement will match the people that you're dealing with. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. The online tools, the software needs that people have, just having a private space to work and reliable internet are not equally accessible to all. It's a really important thing to consider. And then, of course, while there are business needs that have to move forward, and in our case, the Colorado Water Plan update has to move forward, we do have to consider the human impact of this crisis. It's very real, and we all have to give ourselves and everyone else around us some grace as we stumble our way through some of this. Another important lesson that I think I learn every day is you can't over communicate. Both for internal teams and external partners, it's really critical. And I think we've probably all taken for granted that working in an office environment, you can have a casual conversation at the water cooler, so to speak. But now we have to build in process around those conversations, and we have to find ways and schedule ways to engage with the people who are the busiest, and also find ways to schedule and provide direction to people who are now sitting at home and maybe don't have the structure that they used to. So we have to make lots of plans for communicating often and communicating the same thing in several different ways. And I think that we're learning and we're growing relationships and spaces for this, but it's definitely a transition, I think, that we're all experiencing. Oops, I lost my last slide here. Can't really see the buttons very well, Scott, unfortunately.
Oh, sorry about that, Kat. So let me go back one.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. I'll try to go to my next slide here. There we go. Well, maybe not. Give it one more shot, or maybe you want to transition to the next slide. Well, it looks like we may have lost my last slide, and that's okay. Basically, it's that we're transitioning and realizing that there's some major trade-offs between the access and the engagement that you can get from a virtual format and the real need for in-person meetings in some contexts. And in the water community in particular, you really can't you can't lose those face-to-face meetings because trust is such an important currency and entity in water. Those in-person meetings are critical for building that trust. And so we're really missing seeing our stakeholders. But that being said, planning, I think, writ large, and water planning too, has always needed to be more inclusive, and it's an ongoing struggle. And this particular crisis is actually opening our eyes to ways to do that, and ways to improve our engagement, improve our ability to work under difficult budgetary conditions. And so I have to say that I think going forward, we're really going to benefit from the lessons we're learning during the pandemic here, as far as bringing people to the table and broadening the conversation. So that's all I've got for today. Thanks again, Scott. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Kat, and thanks for the grace. I think I probably eliminated your last slide by accident there, so thank you for rolling with it. I'm going to put up another poll here as we transition to the next speaker, and that should be on your screens now. And as you respond to the poll, I'm going to introduce Emily Zemak from CDR Associates. Emily's here to talk to you about the work that she does in engaging with communities around the state, particularly on issues related to water. So Emily, I'm going to hand you the mouse, and we'll close out the poll in 5 seconds here. All right. I'm going to go ahead and share the results. So you'll notice the question was participation and discourse in decision making about water is the most important. And it's a difficult question to answer, but most people said at the regional level. So a majority at the regional level, then a 30% at the local level. Interestingly, 15% said at the state level. So moving on, I'm going to hide that and turn it over to Emily.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks for having me in general. It's good to be here. My name is Emily Zmak. I'm the water practice lead at CDR Associates. And today I'm here to provide a case study on inclusive civic engagement and hopefully to convey, one, that it's a valuable use of your time, but secondly, that it can also be exciting. There's a lot of rules and parameters around inclusive civic engagement, but it's also a creative exercise, really pushing the bounds of how you've traditionally approached your stakeholders. So first, about CDR Associates, we're a nonprofit based in Boulder, Colorado, and we provide stakeholder and facilitation services. Interesting looking at those poll results because we do work locally and regionally, but also across the state, across the country, and even internationally. Water is just one of our practice areas. So I've been fortunate to work on public and environmental policy issues spanning transportation, land, and water use issues. And today, because we only have 10 minutes, I'm not going to do a step-by-step study of how to do inclusive civic engagement, but I am hoping to make a case for why. And there we go, figure out the tech. That's one piece of online inclusive civic engagement. So I recently managed a project with the purpose of soliciting a long-term community vision through a series of focus groups. And a long-term community vision helps inform how investment decisions are being made and what are priority project areas. And oops, one second. It is a little tricky to see the arrows. Oh, sorry, everyone. So, and we had really exciting input from our initial focus groups. We heard things about clean watersheds, healthy riparian areas, improved canopy coverage, and innovative green energy, and all of these really exciting areas for our city to rally behind and invest in. The problem, however, was, although really valuable, the input was primarily from white, educated, and affluent commuters. We knew that when we looked at the census data and the city records, that there were only about 300 residents in this sub-district, and they were primarily Hispanic and lived in 2 neighboring mobile home parks. Additionally, we knew that this was a traditionally industrial area. In fact, it's centered around a former coal-burning power plant, and that there's only 1 school in this community, and that it's an alternative high school. So I went to the city and proposed a few key changes to our project approach. The 2 high overarching changes is that, 1, we needed to work with a Spanish translator and interpreter so that people had the opportunity to provide input in the language that they were most comfortable in. And second, when we looked at who is going to be realizing this vision in the long term, the vision was looking to 2040, I proposed that we engage the high school students themselves. What do you need to stay in your community? What barriers do you see to flourishing and contributing to the broader community in a positive way? In addition, we made several smaller pivots to make our overall approach more inclusive, and this project happened between November 2019 and March 2020, so only the tail end was impacted by Corona, but even beforehand, we were beginning to move to an online platform. So our initial model had been a series of meetings with 2 broad questions, and then the meeting was focused on creative input. And we shifted those questions to an online platform so that if you weren't able to attend a meeting in person for various reasons, you could still contribute and give the exact same feedback as the people who were able to attend in person. Additionally, we varied the times and days that we were offering the focus groups. We had first proposed Tuesday and Thursday evenings. And what's interesting about that is those are convenient times if you work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And what we know about the community that we were working in is there were a lot of service type workers. And so we had several Friday evening meetings that were more convenient for certain demographics than others. We also engaged local leaders. So there, especially when you're representing a government agency, there are trust issues, especially for certain communities that are traditionally marginalized by law enforcement, for example. And so we worked with local leaders who were already engaged with the city to convene the groups. They were the face, they were the contact point, they were compensated for their time, but they were someone who could act as a liaison between the planning process to elicit this community vision and the stakeholders themselves. And then finally, similarly, we shifted locations from government buildings to local facilities. And of course, this happened before Corona, but it's still a relevant frame of thinking. What are the barriers for getting people to your meetings? Instead of expecting people to come to you, how can you go to them? Whether that's calling them up, whether that's providing call-in options for Zoom meetings, whether that's hosting a slide or information webinar on a website that they can access on their own time, but really identifying what those barriers are and then actively working to disassemble them. As you might imagine, our participation increased significantly, and about 70% of our input in the end, in this 4-month project window, came from non-traditional participants, meaning people who aren't white, educated, affluent, and often retired from professional fields. And the diverse focus groups, or you might call them the more accurately representative focus groups, had very different input. We heard things like facilities for homeless encampments along the river. The high school that we engaged, about 1/3 of the students either experienced homelessness or were at risk of homelessness during their high school career. We heard about protection from gentrification, encroaching on the traditional Hispanic neighborhoods. These mobile home parks were near a river, and that's a nice area, and they were facing risk of not being able to afford the homes that they and their families had lived in for a while. And then we heard about things like improved access to river parks and recreation, safer routes to schools. These included things including lighting. It was difficult for wheelchairs and strollers to use certain trails. And just the general accessibility and safety, which is a significant step down from things like healthy riparian areas, which is a broad and kind of intangible vision statement. Accordingly, we developed a more holistic vision statement. It was very different in terms of what was needed to represent the actual communities. We could have just used the early focus group vision statement. It would have been something like, in 2040, our community will integrate natural and built environments into a world-leading model of sustainability, something like that. But when we included the more representative focus group input, we got a statement that would actually mean something in 20 years' time, something that's more representative of the status quo and where they want to go. And that could be something like, in 2040, our community will be a safe and thriving space for all people, meeting more than just the basic needs of its most vulnerable citizens and building upon the link between culture, people, and the environment. Which brings me to the why statement. Why do civic engagement, inclusive civic engagement? And it's because a good final outcome meets the needs of your end users. The classic example is the case of a sidewalk through a park. It's this beautiful sidewalk with 90-degree angles, and cutting off the corners are social trails, the dirt paths of how people actually move through a park. Too often, inclusivity is framed as us doing them a favor, us going out of our way to engage them. And it's important to flip this thinking. At the end of the day, inclusive civic engagement helps you do your job better. Your goal is to provide a service or a product or build an outcome that meets the needs of the people who are going to be using it. And if your engagement is only reaching the easy populations, the affluent, the 9-to-5ers, the educated, the retirees, you're missing a massive chunk of the population which will be using your end goal. And so my hope is that you take away that inclusive civic engagement is pragmatic. It helps develop, to quote Parker actually, it helps develop services that are benefiting your entire community. Thank you. I'm looking forward to the question section at the end. And Scott, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Emily. And thank you for rolling with the technology, everybody. And we're done with our polls for today. So thank you for participating in those. And I want to hand it over now to Jorge Figueroa, Director and Principal of El Laboratorio, and also a board member at Water Education Colorado, to talk about his experience and the importance of grassroots approaches to civic engagement. So Jorge, welcome, and take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Awesome. It's great to see the number of attendees. I know a lot of you, those that I don't know, nice to meet you for the first time. Thank you for inviting me. El Laboratorio, most of what we do is actually inclusive civic engagement in the design of environmental solutions. And why I think that why question is important. I want to share a little bit about that, maybe with a story. I've been working with the Colorado River, or used to work a lot. I still do, from the environmental community here in Colorado. And I convened a couple of years ago a Colorado River Water Summit. And as part of the summit, I brought one of the last living Cocopah River traditional song singers. Cocopah people are the river people of the Colorado River in the Delta. Both in Yuma and in Mexico they live. Their traditions are almost at the brink of extinction. Their knowledge of the river is really important, and I thought it was really beautiful that one of the last living singers of the traditional Cocopah people river songs was going to come to our summit to share with our community his concern that his songs were at the brink of extinction. His language of the river people are at the brink of extinction. And I invited my community, and hardly anybody showed up. I don't think anybody showed up other than the speakers from my community here, professional community working with the Colorado River. Cocopah singer was 19 years old, and it was an amazing blessing that he brought to everybody who participated in that event. The traditional songs are like Greek, like a Greek theater that has like 3 stages or 3 scenes. The first scene starts in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and there's like this 19-year-old singer of the natural ecology of the Rocky Mountains, desert dweller from the Delta, who wanted to pass these songs to the people of the Rocky Mountains that are like thousands of years old, that are on the brink of extinction. When nobody showed up from my community, it made me really question, for whom am I working for, and for whom? Because I would like to work for the Cocopah people. I would like to work for every people who is invested in protecting the Colorado River, and mostly for the people who have been their stewards for thousands and thousands of years. My ancestry, I'm from Puerto Rico. A quarter of my DNA is from Yoruba, Nigeria, and from Taino Indians. The Taino Indians were exterminated by a big pandemic, similar to the one we're having right now, with Spanish conquest. And so the extinction of a people is something that is part of my DNA's history, and my history, my cultural history of my indigenous people. And so I think it's really important when we're talking about environmental education, when we're talking about river protection, that we also talk about cultural protection, cultural preservation, and that we also open our horizons, educational horizons, to what other cultures and traditions can teach us on how we can better manage our ecosystems and design our environmental projects. So maybe the case study, I was thinking of doing another case study, but maybe a relevant case study to this story is that at the end of the day, after that summit, we ended up creating this amazing alliance between the city of Denver, interested stakeholders, and San Luis Rio Colorado, the last Colorado River water user in Mexico. And part of the projects that we did was a viability study. It wasn't a viability study, it was a visioning process in the Delta with Delta stakeholders. We invited the Cocopah people, and the governor of the Cocopah tribe came with his family. We had some other leaders, and we had this singer, a young singer, and his mom come to our visioning workshop. And the contribution that they gave to the visioning workshop that was trying to envision a new park to help bring the Colorado River back to the people of San Luis Rio Colorado, that they haven't had it in the last 60 years. It ends at Morelos Dam. The river passes by, is the last city where the Colorado River passes by. The contribution of the Cocopah people in our workshop was invaluable. And it basically transformed the way that I do my work with communities. I learned so much. One of the things that they were mentioning was, when we're talking about the types of flora and fauna that we want to have, or that they want to have in their greenway, the Colorado River Greenway in Mexico, they were saying that they were not only sharing the traditional trees and that they use for different aspects in their daily life, from making hunting equipment to roof and beams of their houses. But one of the things that they were mentioning was that when you design the park, and when you're integrating native plants into it, you need to think the sound of things, because each species of tree generates a different sound in the park. And so that was like very revelatory to me, and that's an amazing insight that I think that other practitioners in park design could like really benefit from knowing, and from developing designs, looking at different aspects or characteristics, including the sound and the songs that trees sing when the wind passes by. And so this is just an example of like why it's important to include other communities into your projects, because the project would not only benefit, but it might even like transform the way that you do your work. I don't know if I've taken most of my time, but I think I'm gonna stop now.
Thank you, Jorge. And thank you to all of the panelists so far. And we're gonna move now into a portion where we actually have a panel discussion. And before that, I wanna just say thanks again to the sponsor of this webinar, the Colorado Water Conservation Board, for helping make this possible and for helping to bring the speakers together. So the panelists I'm going to ask everybody to go ahead, the panelists, to share your webcam. And I can't quite see the webcam view, but I'm hoping we can see, participants can see the panelists now.
I think we're all here.
We're all here. Awesome. Okay, great. That's one of the limitations of software. Sometimes you just see the presentation slides and not the wonderful faces of everybody involved. Okay, great. So for the panelists, we wanted to have an opportunity to spend the next 20 or so minutes with a few essential questions for each of the panelists to respond to. And then we're also asking for participants in the webinar, for you all to submit your questions as well. So as questions come up, feel free to put them in the questions box, and we'll transition to those participant questions in just a moment. But first, I wanted to start with 2 or 3 questions for each of the panelists, and we'll go in order of the panelists that you see here, as well as in order of the questions. So one question that seems essential to this conversation is, when you're doing community engagement, authentic, inclusive community engagement requires the convener to get out of the way. So if you're the convener, the host, maybe the facilitator, how do you do that? How do you get yourself out of the way and allow the community voice to shine through in the way that Jorge and others described? So I'm going to turn it over first to Parker to give her thoughts on this question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I think one important thing to think about when you are creating community conversations is not to come with any preconceived notions. We often build programs as organizations with really what we already have in mind, like what we think is going to happen, what we think is going to be best for the community, and without even doing that first step. So we need to come with a blank slate. We need to be willing to have things be messy and have things not go totally according to plan, and to really allow people the space and freedom to speak, to say what is best for them. And then the next part of that is to value what is being said, because sometimes we also bring community voices to the table and we're like, okay, this is great, let me hear, what do you need to really engage in nature? Like, what do you need for that? And then they're like, well, I need a community garden on my inner city block, and can we reclaim the cemented basketball hoop park? And we say, that's great, thank you for your voice, thank you for your opinion, here are your passes to take buses to the mountains, because we think that's the best way for you to engage with nature, right? And so we really need to make sure that we also value and understand and work toward what the actual community needs are once we have gone through the labor of getting their voices.
Great, thank you, Parker. I'm going to turn it over to Bora for your thoughts.
Sure, thank you. And Parker, that was just beautiful, because it's absolutely true. My sense is that it's about 85% in your head and your heart. And that you really have to think about, you know, from sort of the education side of things, are you really the type of person who you're the sage on the stage, you know, that, you know, you want to be the center of attention? You know, a lot of educators are in that ballpark. Same thing for civic engagement. You really need to change your perspective. You need to change your heart to say that you're valuing these other perspectives and making sure that you're open to them. You have to think about power. And, you know, are you powerful because you're coming from a particular organization or agency, because of your race, because of your gender, because of, you know, any number of other factors? And really work hard to, first, I think you have to work hard at your own heart and head. And then the strategies can fall from that. You need to think about your biases. You need to pay attention to the differences. You need to pay attention to language. So things like I'm primarily a quantitative researcher. That's what I do. You know, I love Likert scales. You know, tell me from a 1 to 5 how you feel on this. That isn't going to open up participation. You have to ask really big, broad questions and allow the space, as Jorge was saying, for people to tell their stories and to come in with thoughts and ideas and perspectives and background that you never even considered before. And you can't do that with well-structured, you know, sort of boxed in types of activities. And one last little thing is that we really have to worry about our language, and not only the, you know, English versus other languages type of issue, but there's more and more out there around the notion of red language and blue language. And it's sort of the notion that we code our language. And if you tend to be more of a blue kind of person, a more liberal kind of person, you're using languages like in this space. Well, the more red or conservative types of folks go, oh, you're liberal. And so therefore you're coming with this liberal agenda. So we really do have to worry about making sure that our language is truly open and inclusive and as unbiased as it can be, or at least acknowledge our biases.
Thank you, Kat. I'm going to turn it next to Emily. Emily, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. I will say, when in my role in particular, because we're often hired to on specific projects to move things along, this can be really challenging. And so one thing we do early on at usually the kickoff meeting is define what the sandbox is. What's the space that people, the community members, can play within, and where are the boundaries, the limitations, where certain decisions are off the table. And that might include, you know, things like final outcomes, but that there's a lot of space for creativity in between. So the first way of getting yourself out of the way is understanding where there's room for input. Where can we tie community voices into decision making so that that can be communicated? And the second piece I would say on getting yourself out of the way is putting aside any preconceived notions or outcomes you have. Like I mentioned, did the high school focus group, the alternative high school in this community. And even as a millennial, there was nothing more terrifying than walking into a room of 40 17-year-olds and asking for their input on a community vision. They were cooler than me. They had slang I'd never heard of. But at the end of the day, they had ideas that would have honestly knocked the socks off of 45-year-old professionals coming from, you know, their white-collar job to a focus group. And these high schoolers really challenged the way that we had gone about envisioning the future of the community. And by challenging the group or the people that we were engaging, I found myself out of the way simply because I could have never expected the type of input that we received from that group in particular. So I know that's a roundabout way of saying that maybe it comes down to engaging with an external focus instead of an internal focus. If you're thinking about yourself and your preconceived notions, you're probably doing it wrong.
Great, thank you, Emily. And I apologize, Kat, we skipped over you. Kat, go ahead.
No worries. Gosh, there have been so many great points, Emily. I too have done some of that high school outreach, and whoo, man, that is enlightening and daunting. There's so many great points. I think that getting ourselves out of the way is such an interesting question, and in water planning in particular, I think that there are often deadlines and drivers, and the idea of opening the conversation to this messy process like gives a lot of the people leading the process, which are often engineers, very technical people, it just makes them so jumpy, right? Like, well, we don't know what's going to happen then. And I think that it's a conversation that we need to get better at. And I think that in particular right now, as we are in the pandemic, we're the conveners, we have agendas, we're hosting the platform for the conversation. There are so many ways that we are like defining the space, to use the blue word. And I think one of the ways that we can do a better job is trying to be really open-minded and cognizant of how that space is, how we are defining it. And one of the divides that we often deal with is a rural-urban divide where there's limited bandwidth in rural communities. You can't have a lot of people jumping on a meeting like this where there's video and sharing screens without it just exploding or imploding, depending on how you want to look at it. But that's something that we have to think about, having call-in numbers, having ways to maybe try to trim the conversation down. Everybody turn off your videos. Everybody, like, let's get as many people to the table, even if it doesn't necessarily look pretty. And I think that's one way. And I loved what you said, Emily, about to whom does the tool afford power. I think these virtual formats really afford a lot of power to the planners. And unfortunately, I think that can be very limiting, even though it brings more people to the table.
Great, thank you, Kat. And Jorge, you'll round us out, and then I think we'll, with the interest of time, turn it over to one of the questions that we received from participants, and then we'll see where we get from there, and if we can loop back to question number 2. All right, Jorge, your thoughts?
Yes, I've seen a couple of like key issues that should be considered to, I guess, like get out of the way or empower local communities to like really thrive in a process of like let's say co-creation of like environmental solutions. One is that you need, most of the time, most of my projects, the local community requires capacity building. And so if you want to get in their informed comments or suggestions, they need about, for example, designing a river park. It would be good for them to know where the river is, 1, 2, where the water comes from and why clean water is important. Just get them out into the urban river ecosystem, and it might take a couple of adventures, or a couple of, at least for youth, but it might require some capacity building, and it's not just a process in which you can invite community members for a weekend, on a Saturday, and just get them to answer a checklist, and then you're done. I think that pretty strongly that community members should also get paid, and youth should get paid for the time that they're giving you. If you're doing any type of community work and you're getting paid for the community work, it would be also for the community members to get paid. And always, absolutely, you have to adapt and change, even if you have to do it dramatically, based on the community's input, because it's always for them. I'm really excited about the potential to Catherine, to help make the Basin Roundtables platforms for inclusive civic engagement. And I think like the best way to get out of the way is like really through citizen science. Like if citizen science is like apolitical, it like thrives on education and filling in educational gaps and giving the power for community members to figure out more clearly what their problems are and how to giving them the tools to solve the problems themselves. So citizen science is awesome to get out of the way.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jorge, and thanks for all the panelists for your answer to that question. I'm gonna, Kat, I'll prompt you on this one so you're prepared. And then anybody else who wants to jump in. So a question from Caitlin Beekman at CDPHE. We've been utilizing Zoom for online stakeholder meetings in our rulemaking efforts, and we've struggled with getting feedback from smaller organizations. Often the conversations get dominated by large organizations with staff that are dedicated to reading and understanding regulations. Do you have tips, tricks, best practices to getting more feedback from smaller organizations through online meetings? So Kat, I'll hand it over to you first.
Sure, I think that's a great question. And Zoom's a great platform for engaging with smaller groups, I think, because it allows, in some, depending on your level of Zoom, you can have breakout rooms, which can be in a good format, but that, of course, assumes that your small organizations are at the table and have somebody there to participate. One of the other things that I think is really critical in reaching out to communities, and you know, we're trying to do our best to do it, is making sure that you share materials well in advance of meetings so that if somebody cannot attend, they can review the materials that are going to be like in a rulemaking process. They can review the policy documents and provide their feedback in another forum. I think that's really critical. And I think that there's also, like, organizing task forces, I think, can be a useful tool where you actually invite people to participate in smaller group conversations. And I know that it can be challenging when there are dedicated people in large organizations and you're asking somebody from a small organization to, you know, miss dinner with their kids to participate in a task force meeting. That can be a huge challenge, and that's a lot to ask. And I really am intrigued, and I think there's probably some real merit to what was said about potential. You know, I can't say that we're going to do this tomorrow, but to paying people to participate, because that's an interesting idea. I mean, people are giving their time, and some people have more time and privilege to give that time. So I think it's a really important issue to raise. I think that's all I've got. Unfortunately, I know it can be such a hard thing to do.
Thank you, Kat. Others who have thoughts on this and from the panel?
I think it's really great that you're considering equity issues, and you know, I would just say, how can you take that a step further, because that's within your ability or the work that you can do. I liked, you know, what's been said so far, and even what Jorge talked about earlier regarding like paying community members and paying people for their time, because we often don't do that. And if it's important for us to have that feedback, then it's an important mechanism to build in. Also, maybe there is stratifying or parsing out, like Catherine said about small group sessions, you know, parsing out maybe those smaller groups from the bigger groups, because if they're going to give a different type of feedback, you know, then maybe it's worth having a different session that meets at a different time, that is more compatible for those groups to be able to get that feedback.
Great. Thank you, Parker, for adding on to that. And it looks like we have about 4 minutes left on the webinar. I would like to get some thoughts, because we haven't had an opportunity to talk very much about engaging rural communities. I would really like to at least get 1 or 2 panelists to give your thoughts on given limited access to broadband and rural high-speed internet in rural and underserved communities, not just rural communities, but underserved communities as well. How do we reach across that digital divide in this era of virtual engagement? What has worked well from what you've seen or heard of so far? So maybe I'll go with a hand raised from the panelists for who's ready to take that one on. All right, go ahead, Kat.
I can jump in. You know, I would have to say that we definitely deal with the rural-urban divide, much more so than, you know, urban communities where there's limited access to bandwidth and the internet. But along with the rural-urban divide, it's often a huge cultural divide. You know, we're dealing with ranchers and farmers that are on different schedules, that they're out all day long, you know, and you're trying to catch them when they get in the door before they go to bed. I mean, really, it's like they hold meetings very late, like 7 to 9 is a reasonable time for a meeting. And they also, they want to be able to engage. So for example, we've had feedback that somebody is literally riding on their tractor on a Zoom meeting, like on their phone, you know, which is amazing. But not everyone can do that if you don't have good cell phone coverage, for example. So we do always try to provide a call-in number. I think that that's critical because a lot of people have at least access to a phone. I think that that is a really big piece. And I always think that getting materials out ahead of time is helpful too, just so that even if they can't participate in the specific time, that it's you know, they can provide feedback through another format that's more helpful to them.
Great. Thank you, Kat, so much. And I'll just follow up by saying it's my intention to send out a list of resources, including what Bora went over in terms of guidelines for community engagement, as well as, to Kat's point, there's actually a survey done organized by the Colorado Cattlemen's Association pre-COVID that talked a lot about opportunities for outreach to folks in food production in rural areas. So I want to just say one more thank you to our panelists, and I want to let you know that there'll be an evaluation for the webinar immediately at the end of the webinar, so please hang around for that. And just once again, thank you panelists for participating. Thank you for the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education for partnering. And thank you for everybody who joined us on the line. I really appreciate it and look forward to continuing the conversation into the future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.